everyone. I'm Laura Valean, Senior Editor with Commercial Property Executive, and you're listening to Crew Up, CP's quarterly podcast series featuring leaders from the Crew Network community. This episode is especially timely as we continue to mark Women's History Month and take a closer look at the progress and the challenges facing women in commercial real estate today. I'm joined by Alison Beddard, CEO of Crew Network, an organization dedicated to advancing women across the global commercial real estate industry. In this conversation, we build on insights from Crew's latest benchmark study to explore what progress really looks like today, where gaps remain, and what it will take to move the industry forward. Hi, Alison. Welcome back. Happy to speak with you again.
Hi, Laura. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
So this is Crew's fifth benchmark study spanning 20 years, right? When you step back and look at the arc of the data, what story does it tell you about women's progress in commercial real estate?
I've thought a lot about this, Laura. I first like to I want to think about Crew Network's benchmark study gives us something very rare in commercial real estate. It gives us 20 years of longitudinal data. And what it tells us is clear, that progress happens when leaders are acting intentionally, measure outcomes, and sponsor talent. But where we stall is where the accountability stops. And so one thing that I'm really happy to see in this study is that the compensation gap is narrowing and women have more work flexibility than ever before. So we've made good progress in terms of equal pay in the last 20 years as well, but barriers as gender discrimination persist. And a lot transpired in the last 5 years, particularly, including COVID-19 pandemic, significant fluctuations in the commercial real estate sector and the market cycles. So this research has been highly anticipated. Our 2025 study identifies areas where requiring renewed effort and clarifies trends that may offer opportunities for fresh strategies. But bottom line is we still have work to do, but there was positive progress to celebrate.
But women still comprise about 38% of the industry. This number has barely moved in the last 2 decades. Why do you think representation has plateaued despite so much conversation around inclusion?
That's a good insight and good question. Commercial real estate has historically been predominantly a male profession and not a traditional career path. And we have been working for the last 35 plus years, Crew specifically, since we've been around for 38 plus years, to bring more women into the industry early in their careers and advance them to top level leadership. Two things, while we're seeing greater interest from women at the entry level, two things that happen at mid-career. One is that women are leaving the industry or taking breaks for child or family member duties. And then that's where the pay gap begins to widen. I think that what we found is there are more like structural barriers, not pipeline issues. Structural barriers meaning opportunities for advancement within their firms. Mid-career attrition and promotional bottlenecks. And we didn't lose women, but we've lost some momentum. And that's where we see it is at that mid-level career. As more companies prioritize recruiting, retaining, and advancing women, the needle will move and we will see faster progress. The more women that enter the business and see a supportive path to advance to top executive positions, the more women will aspire to do the same. The simple, if she can see it, she can be it. But candidly, we need to see more of it. And we have to keep them in the industry longer. That's truly, I think, the barrier that continues to persist.
There's another barrier that women that participated in the study identified. Basically, they said that gender discrimination is the primary barrier to success. What does that tell you about the current moment we're in?
First thing I would say is there's an increased willingness to name the lived experience. This is the first time. This was pretty eye-opening to me. One thing I will couch is that the study was conducted between January and April of 2025, and the new executive orders from the United States administration had just come out. This was a setback for many in regards to support of DEI programs across corporate America and beyond, and it continues to be. So, there may have been an increased, heightened awareness around this, and obviously stress, that influenced the study. That being said, though, because of the time frame. But that being said, I don't want to diminish at all why it was, that it was cited as the number one barrier to success. I think what we're seeing is it's not worse behavior from people, but maybe greater clarity about what's really going on in their work environments. Because again, we see entry level, not a problem. We bring more people more women and into the industry, but as they continue to advance, those increased levels of responsibility tend to diminish, and there's a variety of reasons why we think that is. And post-pandemic reset surfaced just candidly inequities, around work-life, balance, career ambitions, and things like that as well. So I think it just brought more of this out as people navigated new work environments.
Let's go back to the pay gap you mentioned earlier. I know this narrowed significantly since 2020, but non-salary compensation such as bonuses and commissions continue to drive disparity, especially at senior levels. What do you think needs to change structurally for that gap to truly close or narrow significantly?
Narrowing the pay gap is a significant one. While we still have a ways to go to reach parity in overall compensation and bonus and commission equity, our pay gaps decreased across the board in the last 5 years. This also signifies that companies are making strides in salary parity and that it is time to focus on leveling opportunities for bonus and commission for all professionals. If equity isn't measured, it's optional. For the commission gap to close, companies in teams should intentionally include women when assigning more challenging projects, especially in high-profile client development. Instead of waiting for her to quote unquote be ready, that's an unconscious bias already in itself. So evaluating that behavior question your own behavior when you say, is she ready? Why do you think that? Evaluate it, take a chance on her and give her the opportunity to grow. Women should also be proactively sharing their ideas with their sponsors and managers on the promotions they want or how to position themselves and gain the skills that they need to better position themselves for opportunities that they want. Women can also consider being more open to positions with higher commission opportunities. In this year's study, only 32% of women said they will consider a position that includes commission versus 45% of men. And these numbers have been steadily declining over the last 20 years. So that part is why do women not seek out more risk? Is it structural barriers within the company? Is it because the company, maybe the teams are inherently male or male dominant, so maybe they don't feel seen there or feel like they can be successful. In my past experience hiring and recruiting entry-level brokers, I noticed when offered a draw, I found male brokers were much more likely to accept the draw and kind of a bet on themselves mentality, whereas female brokers would opt to not have a draw at all, so they wouldn't be burdened with paying it back. So it's more nuanced. They were uneasy taking the financial risk. Inherently, what happened though is the men received more sponsorship alignment with the company due to the quote unquote risk taken on both parties to ensure they were successful. So in my experience, the gender ranks tend to close 3 to 8 years in the business, typically when female talent starts to see a widening gap in financial opportunities or client assignments that they're able to secure on their own or with their partners. So partnering on larger teams is a great way to bolster skill sets and client-facing opportunities, but women still need to be mindful that they do need to continue to advocate for themselves and think about their future as far as like their share of the commission pie or their share of business responsibilities on the team as they advance and grow more tenured, because unfortunately, that is where we tend to see a divergence. Assuming your team is going to see your talent and just promote you, doesn't get it done. So that part, I heard it somewhere else. It's like you have to be in control of your own career. You can't expect somebody else to do it for you. Right. Women still need to proactively think of ways to position there. That being said, if you're in a working environment that doesn't align with values or how you're working, women would be better off finding the right place so they can thrive. Commission-based work is one of the most equalizing compensation structures available in commercial real estate, and it's shown over and over how well women excel in brokerage and business development and commission roles. So that tells me that women in the right environment thrive. Employers who recognize that dynamic are more successful in the long term.
There's one particularly concerning finding, in my view, in the study. Women's C-suite representation remains at just 9%, which is unchanged across multiple studies. You mentioned earlier that while more women opt to enter the industry, at some point in their lives, they decide to pause their careers for personal reasons. But there must be other reasons that they don't reach those high-level executive positions. What's preventing that breakthrough at the very top?
Yep. So I'm going to say final gate is sponsorship, not skill. So you have to be
Mm-hmm.
sponsored. You have to see a clear path. Companies that don't have clear paths for leadership or how that looks, or if you're not being sponsored, there's no way you're going to get there. So the first thing is we need to obviously keep more women in the industry. Organizations can work on developing roadmaps for goals and supporting their involvement in the industry, ensuring that they've got the right networks by which they're building their business acumen and their skills, but also their people networks. That is truly very important. The higher up you get, you have to have influence. Second is the last 4 benchmark studies, women have said that having an internal sponsor or mentor in the company was their number one key to future success. So companies being more intentional about this. The third, prioritize and financially support women's professional development and learning. This isn't at the exception of other people in the company, but it is something that you have to lean into if you want to see change, because if women are a minority or don't have the same level of support, how are they going to get it? So be open-minded to leaning into that professional development and learning. Encourage women to pursue leadership development and membership in organizations such as CRE Network and pay for the opportunities. Don't look at them as some kind of extracurricular, but actually a business imperative for you to help them get the skills and the business acumen that you're looking for outside of what they do in their daily work. Increasing the representation of women in leadership will trickle down through all career levels of the industry. If you can see it, you can be it. I see that over and over again. When you see a woman in the C-suite, it truly does inspire others in those organizations to see it and to say, maybe I could consider doing that. So that part is real. The other thing I think is that being conscious of the unconscious bias. Boards tend to promote known quantities, right? So in order to change that, you actually have to evaluate, and it has to become a culturally important for the company to say, hey, we're gonna look at this a little differently, and catch yourself when you say, well, we know so and so, so I'm sure they would be good. That type of thing. And the other thing I would just say is that women tend to be over mentored and under sponsored. And we talk a lot about mentorship and sponsorship. Sponsorship is where someone in a position of influence can help you, and they do, and they put themselves out there in a way, and they vouch for you, and they put their own relationship capital behind you. And that is a very different relationship than a mentoring, which is simply somebody that you can ask advice, or they're willing to provide you advice and help, but they may not actually be in a position to influence or help or be willing to. So and you don't just find a sponsor, just sign up for one. So that's where,
it's not that easy.
That's where sometimes creating more opportunities for women to understand what that looks like. And then also there are cultural issues that I would say within companies that whether or not they recognize that they are either sponsoring or not sponsoring female talent. So some companies do extremely well, others aren't even aware that they're have a problem. So there is definitely a wide range there.
And then there's also another aspect where younger women are really not always wanting to aspire towards C-suite roles. I'm not sure whether you can confirm that or not from your experience, but is that just burnout? They have a different definition of success? Is there something deeper there? Why aren't more younger women showing aspiration towards C-suite roles?
The data showed us in this last study, so only 30% of CRE professionals aspire to the C-suite. And this is a slight decline in aspirations for women from 5 years ago at 32%, and a steep decline, though, for men from 5 years ago when 43% of men aspired to the C-suite. So kind of interesting that we're finding that professionals in general aren't motivated by titles as much. So titles don't matter as much anymore, especially to younger generations of the workforce. There may be a more negative perception of the C-suite, including like no work-life balance, which has become a greater priority for everyone.
Right.
The C-suite is predominantly white and male. So, if you don't see yourself there, see yourself fitting in there, you may not even consider it. Historically, women have stepped into opportunities to lead when times are really tough. And assessing career risk of not being set up for success is high. Also, CEO failure for women is more highly publicized. So that's, think about, do you want to subject yourself to all of that? The more visible and transparent the talent pipeline is in an organization directly translates with more women in leadership roles, though. So the more closed that process is, the less is known. So the less advancement. So I think there's a positive, which is the more you can be transparent with promotion opportunities, what your organization's pipeline for success looks like, offering kind of a clear roadmap and clear, transparent communication around that does yield better outcomes. And I think we will see more people ascending to more of that C-suite, especially breaking down what the perceptions are of the C-suite. And we're into an interesting time. There's just having 5 different generations in the workplace, and everyone having a different viewpoint of what success or career looks like. So we're certainly in an interesting time in our lives.
And then there's another layer that we haven't really had before 2020. Most of us work in a hybrid environment, and that flexibility has increased post-pandemic, and more women are working remotely more than men. But it seems that those in office more often are promoted at higher rates. So would you say we're at risk of creating a new promotion gap through hybrid work?
I think you could be. I would say proximity bias is real. Data shows that women prefer more flexibility in working hybrid versus in office, and that there are still some setbacks if you're not physically in the office. So that is a gap. Employers can evaluate their working models with an eye toward providing flexibility and inclusivity for everyone without impacting compensation or advancement opportunities. So I would put that back on the employer or on the team leaders. Companies should reevaluate their criteria and process for promotions in this new era of hybrid and flexible work and catch themselves when they see proximity bias or when they see maybe behavioral promotions that may or may not be rooted in performance. For instance, and here's an example I like to give, but employers and team leaders can step in on certain parts of the process, like scheduling team meetings at 9:30 versus 7:30 in the morning, maybe when most parents are dropping their kids off for school. A 7:30 meeting, that's pretty old school. It doesn't necessarily drive ultimate productivity. It just may be that that's the way it used to sound and why it showed up, was, get to the office at 7:30, then you're going to be most productive. Not necessarily. Most people, candidly, are up working much earlier. They might do 2 hours of work before they ever take their kids to school, and then they'll organize their day appropriately and get to those key meetings they need to be at. This is not if you want to lean into your career success, you still need to show up and you need to prioritize things in your career to be successful, right? So things like building business influence, building relationship capital, that is all very important. But to say that it only happens at the office, there is intentional time at the office, and it is very important. The office exists for a reason. The office exists for community. It exists for those touch points, those in-person experiences that you can't get anywhere else. And I think that's what we found through the pandemic is we need that. And that doesn't mean that whatever, whether you're a man or a woman or what, that you can't show up to key meetings, you can't participate. But that's very different than creating a value structure that eliminates hybrid work and doesn't allow for more flexibility. When I was at the event in Europe, MIPIM conference, but we heard from the CEO of WeWork, John Santora, and he mentioned just the the importance that the office plays, and how different and how much it's changed and how much it is changing. And everyone kind of on this panel I was listening to agreed that, the era of having 300 desks in an office and that would be your single point of connection, that's gone. That's not coming back. But what's replacing it is that in-person touch point that you can't get anywhere else. It's the meeting after the meeting, the conversation that happens about, hey, what did you think about this? What did you think about this? Can I get your help on this? So everyone, in order to really create and promote innovation, there still needs to have an in-person component. And I think employers are going about it very different ways. Some that are fully remote, they still have in-person meetings. They'll get together at certain points in the year, or they'll bring their teams together. They may just have a more distributed workforce. So I think it's kind of rethinking what that value structure looks like for employers. And candidly, it's just a value prop on how they evaluate and support their talent.
Right. Speaking of supporting talent, the study found that less than half of companies offer programs aimed specifically at advancing women, and even fewer support other underrepresented groups. Why does implementation lag behind intention?
Well, DEI, or diversity, equity, inclusion programs, it's easy to say, it's hard to operationalize. What we found is that we know that inclusion of different people based on gender, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation is a business advantage and reflects our diverse clients and communities. Companies that prioritize diversity, equity, inclusion are outperforming others, including greater earnings, better governance, greater innovation, and more opportunity. I think part of the areas where companies have struggled is there's a lack of ownership and KPIs around it. And programs without power don't move outcomes. So you can say you're doing it, but unless you're organized and it is a cultural priority for the company, it's going to be hard to make meaningful progress there. And I would call to action and encourage, despite political pressures, leaders should stay grounded in their company values, in their people values, and continue to understand the issues presented in this benchmark study and treat resolving them as a business imperative. Because at the end of the day, talent is talent. Right. And the talent in our companies reflects the talent of our clients, or it should. And if it doesn't, that's going to be a business disadvantage going forward. So I would continue companies to think about their strategies around their talent and continue to invest in their talent and help them, because everybody learns and needs different things. And I think it comes back to how that company wants to excel. In long term, we know that investing in your people is the right thing, and it does actually create a better business advantage.
Alison, as CEO of CRE Network, what are you seeing among male allies in the industry? Are attitudes really shifting, or are perceptions diverging between men and women?
Laura, so for the first time, women reported gender discrimination as the number one barrier to success. 79% of men said opportunities had improved since 2020 versus only 62% of women. So this difference could signal an overestimation of women's advancement by some men, or an underestimation of gender disparity and discrimination. The discrimination is a difficult barrier to break down because it's often unconscious and challenging to identify. It could be inherent or disguised by things like, it's just the way it's always been done,
Right.
But there is a gap between perception and lived reality here. And I think this is what it says. It's important to have conversations in the workplace to better understand each other's perspectives. I love to say, I actually don't like using the term call out a bias, because that feels so accusatory as opposed to have a conversation. But it does take courage to have a conversation, and with somebody who may have a different viewpoint. But the more I have found, if you're willing to sit down and talk with somebody and maybe try to understand where they might be coming from, you may or may not impact that person in the moment, but you may plant a seed with them that will change the course of behavior. So we do have to have the courage to have those discussions, especially something like this over the last 5 years, seeing that maybe men believe equity's been achieved, but women experience daily friction. And the gap between perception and lived reality it exists. The men listening to this call, industry leaders on this call will think about this and think about how they can be a champion for closing this gap and kind of creating those opportunities for conversation. They can do a wealth of good on that front.
Right. And that leads me to my last question, because March is a special month, at least theoretically. We celebrate Women's History Month, but in my opinion, we should celebrate talent any month, and no matter what sex, religion, and gender anyone has, whatever, we should celebrate talent in general, no matter what. But as Women's History Month comes to an end, what's the one action you'd challenge industry leaders to take in the next 12 months that would really accelerate progress for women?
Thank you, Laura, for having me on. To kind of leave things, one thing I'd love to challenge industry leaders to do is tie advancement, compensation, and visibility to measured outcomes. And my challenge is personally sponsor at least one woman into a revenue or a P&L driving role in the next 12 months. If you actually do that, think about somebody on your team, we could actually probably do a lot more, being intentional about that. And, I think as I just kind of reinforcing some of the topics that we talked about today is, again, data doesn't accuse, it just reveals and offers us an opportunity for conversation. Representation doesn't stall by accident. So we are all part of this. Mentorship gives advice, but sponsorship gives opportunity. And if equity isn't measured, it's optional. So the more that we measure it, the better we can be and the more that we can have positive progress.
Thank you, Alison, so much for sharing your perspective and for the important work you're doing to move the industry forward.
Thank you, Laura. I appreciate being on today.
Thank you for listening to Crew Up. If you enjoyed this conversation and want to hear more insights from CRE industry experts, make sure to follow CP Podcasts on your favorite platform. That's where you'll find all of Commercial Property Executive's podcast series, including Crew Up. You can also stay up to date with the latest news, trends, and analysis at cpexecutive.com. Thanks again for listening. Till next time.